If we look at the medieval sources of Norse mythology, we are not looking, first of all, at sets of commandments, right? We don't get do this, do that, the punishment for X is Y. In fact, I'm fairly sure, as someone who, for the years that I've had to put into it, has probably read the Poetic Edda and Prose Edda as many times as anyone alive, that there is in fact no normative statement anywhere like do X or the punishment for it should be Y, except maybe in a very abstract mythological way with very big guidelines like, Völuspá, the poem about Ragnarok. We hear about men who break their oaths or seduce other men's wives wading a particular river. That's probably the closest thing we get to normative statements. And note that those normative statements are about pretty big, like headline crimes, not really about grooming things. I do suspect that most men who practice this religion had beards, because I suspect that most men just were surrounded by other men who did, right? Most of us grow up in a society that sort of shapes what we think of as normal, and what we think of as normal has a lot more to do with what other people do than with what any religious text says. And I want to put an asterisk on that word text and come back to it in a second. So, for example, I'm speaking English right now, so if you're listening to me, I assume you do too. And just about everybody who's ever learned English has encountered a Christian, right? I've encountered plenty of Christians in my day. They all wear pants. But I am aware from taking an interest in the Bible over the years, wanting to see what's in there, and having, I can say never like front to back, but having read it comprehensively in pieces, sometimes repeatedly, that there is nothing in there that says that you must wear pants. Yet, there are many commandments, like explicitly phrased as commandments, that you will find no Christian who does, especially stuff in the Old Testament, right? The Deuteronomy, Numbers, stuff that you should and shouldn't eat. And I think that it's relevant to note that you would therefore not say that it is a religious commandment that Christians wear pants, but that in our present day environment, it is a cultural norm that Christians wear pants, and that's pretty reliable. Now, when I am contacted, as I sometimes am, by individuals at institutions like prisons or officers in the military, the first thing I always say is I am not a cleric, right? I do not represent any modern pagan organization. There is a huge variety of them that believe all kinds of things and are on every political spectrum, from the furthest right to the furthest left. I'm involved in none of them. But if you want to know what the medieval texts say, none of them mention beards. Because usually what will happen is some prison official and military officer will say, I have somebody who wants to grow a beard because he says he's a Norse pagan. And I'll say, all right, all I can give you is a historical perspective. Yes, Norse pagans, probably the men, had beards. Shaving was relatively unusual in the pre-modern world, although in some cultures it was normal even a pretty long time ago. Ancient Egyptians shaved, Romans shaved, plenty of peoples in the Americas shaved. But if you don't have to do it, and if it's not normal to do it, you're not going to do it. Now, in the sagas, in the Icelandic sagas, like Njál's saga is a great example, one of the biggest and most famous, we have men made fun of for not being able to grow a beard. But I don't think that's any more unusual than any other hyper-masculine insult. Men are always insulting each other in every culture about marks of masculinity that they lack. And in fact, even in a society that shaves, it may be something that men make fun of other men for, that you can't grow it, right? I mean, even among Romans who did shave, it was a big deal when you started shaving. When I was younger, and pretty much everybody shaved before that, I guess, changed somewhere in the early 2000s. It was kind of a big deal when you started shaving, right? That was like a little bit of a rite of passage or something. So it's not, so far as I can document for you or support, any sort of religious requirement. And I don't think you can read the Poetic Edda in Old Norse. I don't think you can read the Poetic Edda in my translation or anybody else's and find commandments or statements that contradict that. Now, whatever, again, a modern pagan group's practices might be, it's their business, but it doesn't have a known historical basis. Hey folks, we'll be back to your regular presentation in a moment, but for right now, I'm here at Grimfrost World Headquarters Longhouse with Johan Hegg, and I just want to remind you that if you have Viking needs, you have a Viking supplier. Grimfrost really cares about getting things right, and if you need replica, well, anything, right? Shields, helmets, weapons, board games, cool t-shirts, hats, all sorts of accessories like that. You can get them at grimfrost.com together with my books, and they ship just about anywhere in the world. So check them out. It does help support the channel. Now, I said put an asterisk on text because these texts that I'm talking about, the Poetic Edda and then the Prose Edda, which is even less like a religious book, were not thought of as written texts by the people who believed in them. One of the things that we encounter so often is that, even for those of us who aren't Christian, we grow up in a society that's so inundated in the Christian understanding of religion that we expect a religion to have a written canon. Norse paganism probably didn't. And when I say probably, I mean I'm 99.9999999% sure. I'm only saying probably because anything could be proven true somehow, right? Most societies throughout history have not had a written canon for their religion. That is a fairly new thing because writing is a fairly new thing. And in fact, even societies that are very literate, like in India, haven't necessarily very recently adjusted to the idea of writing down that religious canon. The Vedas include prohibitions against writing the Vedas, and the Vedas, which date back linguistically about 2,000 years, don't get written down until about when the Eddas do, around the medieval period. I think that very likely what we're looking at is a society that transmitted its sacred literature orally, much like in India, and that the idea of writing it down was quite foreign, so that when someone says to me, well, it's Christians that destroyed all of these writings, I think, well, Christians certainly didn't want to pass along this rival religion. That's true enough. But I don't think there was actually writing to destroy. You can fault Christians for perhaps not writing down more of that rival religion's lore, but it's natural that they wouldn't, right? What is the argument for spending the time and resources on writing that down when what you're trying to do is spread something else? What's surprising is that people did start writing down that oral literature as it continued to be passed down for several centuries after the conversion, just as stories, right? The Eddas contain lots of really interesting stories. Obviously, I encourage you to read my translation of the Poetic Edda and my forthcoming translation of the Prose Edda if you want to see what these stories are like. But they don't include religious instruction. We don't get a notion of what the religious holidays are, the religious practices are. We have only the barest hints of how to pray or sacrifice or things like that. But I suspect that the right way to pray or sacrifice was much more important to the actual religion than anything about grooming, than anything about your hair or beard or clothing or anything like that, because gods are very often transactional, right? What you give them in the form of sacrifice or perhaps prayer is a much bigger deal than just what you perform on earth. This is again something that's a little bit alien to those conditioned, I think, more by a Christian or post-Christian concept where God really cares about your private conduct. These are much more community-based systems of belief, I think, and it's much more the community that's going to punish you for stepping outside of the norms. It's actually not very different from the way that most of us live today. It's just not how we mostly think about religion. This is one of the reasons why I privately, and this is just getting into my own personal beliefs and thoughts here for a moment, ascribe zero importance to the religion or lack of religion of my friends and family. I find that there are wonderful people who also are religious. There are terrible people who also are religious, and they are of any given faith or they are of no faith, right? I find that the professed creed has very, very little to do with someone's actual behavior, and perhaps that's a shame, but it seems to be quite true. And I think that we underestimate when we get very invested in a particular religion. We overestimate how much the signaling that's expected of us inside of a society is correlated with the virtues of a religion. Maybe I'm losing the thread and rambling a little bit too much here, but my TLDR on this is, yes, Norse pagans probably largely had beards. No, there's no reason to think that it was because of a religious requirement as opposed to a cultural norm. No different from the fact that most Christians wear pants. All right. Well, I appreciate you folks for watching and supporting the channel, including in this month when it's a little bit difficult to get outside and use some of the beautiful backgrounds that I'm a little bit more used to using. Appreciate you folks checking out the second edition of my Poetic Edda translation. And for now, from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.